And it's almost now as if you were trying to protect that.
Oh, yes.
What is it?
It was extremely special. It was very strong.
Strong in the what?
Elvis Presley spent his life under the spotlight, but when the stage was gone and only silence filled Graceland, he finally spoke words he had kept buried. In his last moments, as the shadows grew heavy around him, he revealed a secret that shook the walls of his past. It was not about fame nor about fortune. It was about Ann-Margret, the woman who had touched his soul like no other. His deathbed confession was raw, heartbreaking, and completely unexpected. What Elvis whispered in those final hours will leave you stunned and breathless. The last sunset at Graceland. Graceland lay in silence. The wide gates that once welcomed thousands stood closed, and the house, once alive with laughter, music, and the sound of footsteps rushing up and down its hallways, had grown still. The outside world still called him the King, still cheered for his voice, his records, his face shining from posters, but inside those walls, Elvis Presley was only a man nearing the end of his road. His bedroom was dim, the curtains drawn against the harshness of the sun, though faint streaks of light still pressed their way through, spilling across the floor like faded memories. Dust hovered in the air, caught in the quiet beams as if time itself had slowed down. Machines hummed faintly in the background, a reminder of how fragile his body had become. On the bed lay Elvis, the man who had once commanded stages with nothing more than a smile and a song. His breathing was shallow, his chest rising and falling in uneven rhythm, and his once strong voice, the one that had lifted entire arenas to their feet, now came out soft and fragile. He shifted occasionally as though restless even in his weakness. His mind was awake, but his body no longer followed its lead. Nurses moved carefully around him, their steps measured, their voices hushed. Family members lingered nearby, faces drawn with sorrow. A few friends, those who had stood beside him through years of triumph and heartbreak, kept watch from the corners of the room, their eyes heavy but filled with love. Yet Elvis had begun to turn them away more often, requesting quiet, requesting solitude. He no longer wanted the constant presence, the whispered reassurances, the endless reminders of his fading strength. He wanted silence, a space where he could hear the thoughts that had been buried for too long. The night stretched differently now. Darkness came softly, and with it the sounds of crickets outside, the faint rustle of leaves in the Memphis air. The house seemed to breathe around him as though the walls themselves remembered every song, every argument, every laughter that had filled them. In his room, though, there was only stillness. Time blurred for Elvis. Morning light and evening shadows slipped into one another without pause, leaving him adrift in endless hours. He felt the weight of days but no longer counted them. Each moment seemed both endless and fleeting, as if he knew time was running out, and yet he lingered, waiting for the courage to say the one thing that had stayed locked in his heart. His face told stories even when his lips did not. His eyes, though dulled by exhaustion, still carried flickers of longing. His brow sometimes furrowed with guilt, and at other times softened with tenderness when a memory passed through him. Those who sat near his bedside could sense it, the way he drifted into thoughts too deep to share. Something hung in the air around him, something unspoken but heavy enough to be felt. In his sleep, his lips moved. The nurses noticed it first, then his family. Names slipped from him in whispers. Sometimes he breathed out Priscilla, his voice weighted with history. Other times it was Lisa Marie, spoken with love that even sickness could not weaken. But more often than any other name, it was a different one that startled those listening closely. "Anne," he murmured, his voice so faint it was almost part of the air. The name repeated itself on different nights, sometimes with a pause, sometimes with a sigh. "Ann-Margret," he whispered once, so clearly that those nearby exchanged uncertain glances. No one asked aloud, but the question hung between them. Why her? Elvis knew why. Every time the name slipped from his lips, he felt the pull of memories that refused to fade. memories that had lived with him for decades, hidden behind the curtain of his public life. He had carried them silently, never speaking of them in full, never allowing the world to know. But now, lying there with each breath harder to take than the last, he felt the secret pressing against his chest, demanding release. Some nights he reached for the bedside table, his thin fingers brushing across papers and pens left there. His hand trembled as though he wanted to write, but he would pull back, closing his eyes instead, as though the truth was too heavy for ink. Other times he stared at the ceiling, lips moving as if he was speaking to the ghosts of his past, voices only he could hear. The silence of his room grew thicker with every passing day. It was not the silence of peace, but of waiting. He could feel it in his chest, a truth so long buried it burned now to escape. He knew he could not leave without unburdening his soul. To carry it with him to the grave would mean leaving part of himself unfinished, unseen. One evening, when the air outside was warm and still, Elvis stirred. The shadows of the room stretched across the floor as a lamp flickered gently by his bed. A nurse adjusted his blanket. A family member leaned close, brushing hair from his damp forehead. His eyes opened slowly, weak but steady, and he drew in a breath that sounded like it came from the depths of his heart. "I need—" His voice broke, rough and fragile. His hand shifted against the sheets, reaching outward with effort. "I need a pen and paper." The room fell into silence. The few who were present froze, startled by the sudden clarity in his tone. Someone quickly placed a notepad and pen in his hand. His fingers trembled as they closed around them, but he held on tightly, as if they were his final anchor. His eyes, once the color of a summer sky, now dimmed by illness, still carried a glint of fire. He drew in another breath, his lips trembling as though the words fought to break free. "I need to tell the truth," he whispered, each word slow, each one heavy. His chest rose and fell sharply as he struggled for strength. He lowered his gaze to the paper, his voice softer now, almost like a prayer. "About her." The pen hovered above the page, his hand unsteady, his body weak. Yet his purpose was unshakable. The truth he had carried for so long was finally ready to be written, ready to leave the shadows. His breathing rasped as though every inhale cost him, but he pushed forward. The silence in the room deepened, almost alive, as if Graceland itself leaned closer to listen. The walls that had witnessed his laughter and his tears now seemed to wait with the same patience as those standing near his bed. For the first time in decades, Elvis Presley was not writing for the world, not for the fans who adored him, not for the legend he had become. He was writing for himself, for the man he truly was, for the woman whose name had lived in his heart through every triumph, every fall, every lonely night. The pen touched the page. His hand trembled, his lips parted once more, and a single whisper escaped, faint but clear. "Ann-Margret." And with that, the room held its breath. The king at last was ready to tell the story that had never been told. The flame that never passed. The night in his Graceland bedroom grew heavier, and Elvis closed his eyes. The weakness of his body pressed down on him, but his mind slipped backward, chasing the only place where his strength still lived, memory. In the silence of his failing breath, he returned to a time when his heart had beat faster, when the world was brighter, and when one woman had changed everything. It was the 1960s. He saw the set of Viva Las Vegas spring to life around him once more, the buzzing of cameras, the echo of music, the swirl of costumes and voices. He stood there again, not the frail figure he had become, but the king in his prime. The lights were dazzling, and the air smelled faintly of hairspray, fresh paint, and the sweet perfume of show business. But none of it compared to the moment she walked in, Ann-Margret. The first time he laid eyes on her, he felt something snap in place, like a lock turning to the right key. She wasn't just beautiful, though her beauty could have stopped clocks. It was more than that. Her presence had a fire to it, a spark that made every corner of the room brighter. Elvis remembered the way her laughter carried, not like the laughter of anyone else, but like a melody written just for him. Their eyes met across the set, and in that single look, he felt it, something instant. something unspoken, something that would never let him go. He would later whisper to himself that their souls had recognized each other, as if they had been waiting for this meeting all along. From the first moment, the chemistry between them was alive, too strong to be denied. Scenes filmed together carried an energy the cameras could barely capture. Every touch seemed charged with electricity. Every glance lingered longer than it should. Every line of dialogue burned with a heat that came not from the script, but from them. He could still recall the little things. The way she would tilt her head and grin at him when no one else was watching. The way she danced not for the camera, but for him. And how sometimes in the middle of a scene, their laughter broke loose, genuine and unstoppable. Those moments, those stolen, unguarded seconds, were brighter than the lights of the stage. Elvis remembered the nights after filming, when the noise of the set faded, and it was just the two of them. They shared songs, dreams, and secret smiles. There were times when he reached for his guitar and she sat nearby, her eyes soft, her hand tapping lightly in rhythm, as though the music flowed from both of them at once. The bond between them was not just passion, it was understanding, deep and rare. Yet even in those moments of joy, a shadow loomed. Elvis had a life outside the set, a life filled with promises and obligations. Priscilla's face came to him often, her eyes filled with trust, with love he had promised to honor, and there, in the heart of his struggle, Elvis felt the pull of two worlds. On one side stood duty, on the other stood desire. The pull of Ann-Margret was unlike anything he had ever known. With her he felt free, stripped of the weight of being the king. She did not see the crown, the fame, the endless expectations. She saw him, the boy from Tupelo, the man beneath the spotlight. With her, he could laugh like himself, dream like himself, and be simply Elvis. But every time he thought of surrendering to that freedom, the chains of responsibility wrapped tighter. He was a husband. He was a father. He was the idol of millions. Could he walk away from all of it for the sake of one woman, no matter how deeply she stirred his soul? The struggle wore at him. There were nights when he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, Ann-Margret's laughter echoing in his mind. He remembered her words, soft and teasing, "Imagine if we could just disappear." They had dreamed together sometimes, dreamed of a quieter life, far away from the flashes of cameras and the pull of headlines. A little house, music for themselves, no crown, no throne, just love. But dreams are fragile things, and reality was heavy. Fame clung to him, duty called him back, and family held him still. Slowly, that dream of escape slipped through his fingers, leaving him with nothing but the fire still burning inside. He sighed as he lay on his bed, remembering the secret chapters the world had never seen. To the public, theirs had been a short flame, a passing rumor whispered through newspapers and magazines. But Elvis knew better. What the world saw was only a shadow. Behind closed doors, their connection had been something richer, deeper, and far too powerful to be written away as gossip. There were moments when her silence spoke louder than any word. He could still feel the way she looked at him when no one else was there, as if she was memorizing him, not the performer, but the man. There were times when their hands brushed and the world fell away. And in those moments, Elvis swore he saw eternity. The years had carried them apart, but the bond never broke. They lived separate lives, walked different roads, and fulfilled different promises, yet something invisible tied them together still. Ann-Margret had never betrayed that connection, never sold their story, never let the world taste the truth that belonged only to them. Her silence, her loyalty, had been proof of what they had shared. And as the years passed, Elvis admitted to himself what he could never say out loud. He had never stopped loving her. Through the noise of fame, through the storms of his choices, through the loneliness that fame could never cure, she had remained in the quietest, deepest part of his heart. The weight of it pressed on him now more than ever. His breath trembled, his eyes glistened with memories, and he turned his head toward the quiet room. "She was the one who understood me," he whispered, his voice weak but clear. "The only one who saw me." The words slipped into the silence, a confession carried not to the crowds or the world, but to the quiet of Graceland, and the memory of the woman who had lit his heart like no other. The silence between them. The walls of Graceland stood silent, their grand shadows stretching across the evening floor, but inside Elvis Presley's heart the noise of memory refused to quiet. His body was frail now, worn down by years of strain, but his mind wandered restlessly, refusing to rest. There was a truth buried deep within him, a truth that had waited far too long to be spoken. He let his eyes close, and the past swept him away. Not to the dazzling set where he had first met Ann-Margret, not to the laughter and fire of their beginning, but to the years after, when life pulled them apart, thread by thread, until all that remained was distance, silence, and the sharp ache of regret. He remembered how it began, not with anger, but with life's cruel insistence. There were promises already made. There was Priscilla, young, trusting, devoted, looking to him as both husband and protector. There were vows, a marriage built on expectation as much as love. A home filled with responsibility. He could not abandon her, not without consequence, not without tearing apart the foundation that so many had already invested in. Around him, fame moved like a storm that would never calm. His tours stretched endlessly, carrying him from city to city, stage to stage, drowning him in cheers and flashing bulbs. Each performance was a triumph, but each triumph was also a chain, binding him tighter to the image the world demanded. His days were not his. His nights were swallowed by the endless cycle of rehearsals, interviews, and the lonely quiet of hotel rooms when the lights finally went out. And far away, Ann-Margret was rising higher, her name glowing in bold letters across marquees, her career blossoming in full bloom. She was becoming untouchable, dazzling in her right, the flame of her star burning brightly across the world. Their roads stretched apart not by choice, but by design. Two lives consumed by fame, two hearts pulled in opposite directions. Yet even when she was not near, he felt her. She lingered like a shadow behind every curtain, like a whisper in every song. She was not in his home, not in his arms, but she lived in the corners of his thoughts. He could be surrounded by thousands, drowned in the roar of applause, and still sense her presence. It was as if she existed somewhere beneath his skin, too deep to erase, too strong to deny. Lonely nights pressed hardest against him. He remembered lying awake after shows, the noise of adoring fans fading into silence. The cheers vanished, the laughter passed away, and he was left with nothing but the sound of his breathing. In that stillness, her memory came alive. He would see her smile, hear her laugh, feel the warmth of the glances they had once shared. The emptiness beside him seemed larger in those moments, and he wondered if she too ever lay awake, haunted by the same thoughts. The guilt pressed against him like a stone. He had chosen one path, but his heart had longed for another. He could not deny his devotion to Priscilla, nor the love he bore for his daughter. But there was a corner of his soul that belonged only to Ann-Margret. It was a corner he could never give away to anyone else, a place untouched by time. And the weight of it cut deep. He carried fear alongside that guilt, fear of what the world would have said if he had chosen differently, fear of scandal, of betrayal, of losing the crown that the world had placed on his head, fear of how the newspapers would twist their story, how fans would turn against him, how reputations would shatter. He had been the king, but the king was never allowed to simply be a man. There were times when he almost broke free of that fear. He remembered standing over the phone, hand hovering, the desire to hear her voice burning hot in his chest. Just one call, just one word, and the distance could have been bridged. Other times he sat with pen in hand, ready to write the words he had kept inside. I miss you. I need you. I still love you. But the phone was always set back down, the letters left unwritten, the silence kept intact. Pride bound him, fear froze him, and the moments slipped away again and again. The years passed, and still she never spoke. She carried their story quietly, guarding it as though it were a treasure. In a world where secrets could buy fame and gossip was a currency more powerful than gold, she never once betrayed him. She could have. The world would have listened. But she did not. That silence meant more to him than he could ever say. It was louder than any words, stronger than any declaration. Her loyalty was not in speeches, not in grand gestures, but in the choice she made every day to keep what was theirs untouched by the world. She protected him without asking for anything in return, and in that silence Elvis saw a love purer than he had ever known. He thought of her often as the years grew heavy, not just in the light of memory, but in the shadows of what he had lost. He had lost more than love. He had lost the chance to be his truest self. With her, he had not been Elvis the superstar, Elvis the idol, Elvis the legend. With her, he had been only Elvis, just a man, just a soul longing to be seen. And she had seen him, truly seen him, beyond the crown, beyond the stage, beyond the noise. She had understood the boy from Tupelo, the man who wanted nothing more than to be held without expectation. She had accepted him as he was, and he had let her slip away. Now, as the weight of his years bore down on him, his voice cracked with the truth he could no longer keep hidden. His eyes shone with tears that blurred the room before him, and he whispered the words that had haunted him for decades. "I let her go," he said, the confession trembling in the air, "and I've been paying for it ever since." The silence that followed was heavy, yet gentle, wrapping around him like the echo of a song fading into the night. It was the truth at last, spoken not to crowds or cameras, but to the quiet of his room, to the shadows of Graceland, and to the memory of the woman who had carried his heart even when distance had claimed their days. The confession that shook the room. The night at Graceland was heavy with silence, as though the house itself knew that the man it had sheltered for so long was nearing the end of his journey. Shadows stretched across the walls, and the ticking of a clock seemed louder than it had ever been before. In his room, Elvis Presley lay weak against his pillows, his breath shallow, his body frail, but his eyes still searching, still restless. The world outside still called him the king, but here in the dim quiet of his bedroom he was only a man, carrying a heart full of memories and a truth that weighed heavier than all the crowns of fame. His voice had grown softer with the years, yet it carried a quiet urgency now, an insistence that he could not leave without unburdening himself of the secret he had carried for so long. A family member sat beside him, watching his trembling hands, listening to the soft rasp of his breathing. The nurse lingered near the door, respectful of the intimacy of the moment. Elvis shifted slightly, his eyes glistening, his lips parting as though each word cost him the little strength he had left. "I cannot go," he whispered, his tone frail but steady. "Not until I tell the truth about her." The room stilled. The family member leaned closer, their hand gently covering his, encouraging him to go on. His words came slowly, each syllable dragged from deep inside, but his eyes carried fire. "It was Ann-Margret," he said, his breath trembling. "I loved her more than I ever admitted, more than I ever told a soul." The confession seemed to shift the air itself. The silence thickened, holding his words as though the walls of Graceland had been waiting for them, as though they too had carried the weight of his secret. He paused, his chest rising with effort, his eyes wet with the sorrow of years gone by. His voice cracked as he continued. "She wasn't just someone I cared for. She was my soulmate, the one who understood me, not the king, not the performer, but me." His hand tightened slightly against the sheet, his knuckles pale, his lips quivering with the ache of what he was revealing. Life, fame, fear, they kept us apart. I made choices that pulled me away from her, choices I thought I had to make, but they cost me more than I ever thought they would. He stopped for breath, his chest heaving lightly, and for a moment his eyes seemed to drift towards something beyond the room, something only he could see. When he spoke again, his voice carried both strength and despair. "I loved others, yes, I cared for them, I gave what I could, but no one ever reached me the way she did." The family member at his side felt tears welling up, their throat tightening at the raw truth spilling from his lips. The image of Elvis Presley, the legend, the icon, now stripped down to a man confessing the most vulnerable part of himself, was almost unbearable. Elvis's eyes closed for a moment as though gathering strength. Then he opened them again, staring at the ceiling as though replaying every moment he had ever lived with her in his mind. "She saw me," he whispered, "saw me, and I let her go." His voice cracked, breaking under the weight of regret. "I should have fought harder for her, I should have, but I did not, and I've been paying for it ever since." The room was heavy with emotion. The family member pressed their hand to their mouth, fighting back sobs, while the nurse turned her gaze away, giving him the dignity of his confession. Tears slid down Elvis's face, his breath shaky, but his words kept flowing as though his soul refused to leave until every truth was spoken. "I lived for the stage, for the music, for the people, but with her I lived for myself. I was just a man, just Elvis. No spotlight, no crowd, just her and me." He turned his head slightly, his eyes finding the family member beside him. "Do not ever think it wasn't real, it was real. The deepest thing I ever felt." His words left those present stunned. The king of rock and roll, whose life had been written and rewritten in headlines, carried within him a secret that no newspaper had ever truly captured. The idea that his greatest love had remained hidden, unspoken, shook the room like an earthquake. Tears ran freely now, not just his but theirs too. The truth was raw, undeniable, and heartbreaking. Elvis Presley, the man adored by millions, had carried a hidden wound, a quiet regret that had followed him to his final hours. "I wish I could tell her," he whispered, his voice almost fading into the silence. "I wish I could look her in the eyes and say it plain that I never stopped." The room quivered with the weight of those words. His breathing grew weaker, his chest rising and falling with visible effort. His voice came one last time, softer than a prayer, trembling on the edge of the eternal. "Tell her, I never stopped." With those words, his eyes fluttered closed, his face softening, as though the confession had lifted a burden too heavy to carry. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the house seemed to hold its breath. The family member pressed his hand gently, whispering through tears, but Elvis did not answer. His final truth hung in the air, sacred and unshakable, a confession that could never be undone. Graceland itself seemed to fall into mourning, its walls absorbing the final whisper of the man it had sheltered for so long. The pictures on the walls, the silent halls, the echoes of his music seemed to bend toward his last words, holding them like a song never to be sung again. The secret he had carried for decades was finally free. It did not belong to the newspapers or the flashing lights. It belonged to him, to her, and to those who had heard it in the stillness of that room. And for those who sat and witnessed, nothing would ever be the same again. What do you think about Elvis Presley's confession? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do not forget to like, subscribe, and share this story, so his voice keeps echoing long after the curtains close.